Angela Brooks moved her family to a quiet suburb, hoping for peace. Instead, whispers followed them. One night, her daughter Maya witnessed a crime across the street. Soon, suspicion turned toward Angela's husband, David. Evidence seemed damning. The neighborhood judged quickly, but in court, a quiet neighbor revealed the truth and the real culprit. Justice prevailed, proving character is stronger than prejudice. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Maplewood, Illinois welcomed late August with a mild breeze and a pale blue sky stretched thin over rows of nearly identical houses. The air carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass and distant rain that never quite arrived. Lawns were trimmed with care. Mailboxes stood straight and polished. It was the kind of suburban quiet that felt rehearsed. Steady, predictable, controlled. Into that quiet rolled a moving truck. Angela Brooks stood on the sidewalk, holding a small ring of brass keys that glinted in the afternoon sun. She was 35 years old, tall and slender, with deep brown skin and expressive dark eyes that often revealed her thoughts before her words did. Her posture was straight, almost protective, shaped by years of working twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. Her natural curls were pulled back neatly, practical but elegant. Angela had the kind of calm presence that softened rooms, but life had taught her vigilance. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Chicago, she had learned early how quickly warmth could shift into suspicion. Beside her, David Brooks stepped down from the truck with a box balanced easily in his arms. At 38, David carried himself with quiet strength. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements deliberate, his voice steady and measured. His skin was a shade darker than Angela's, his jawline strong, his eyes thoughtful. He wore worn jeans and a navy t-shirt dampened slightly with sweat from the drive. David was the kind of man who believed in solving problems silently. He had grown up in Detroit, the son of a mechanic, and had built his life around patience and discipline. But there were moments, rare and carefully hidden, when frustration tightened his jaw just enough to show. Between them stood Maya Brooks, 14 years old, slender, slightly taller than most girls her age. Her braids fell neatly over her shoulders, framing a face that still carried traces of childhood softness, though her eyes had begun to sharpen with teenage awareness. Maya had inherited Angela's height and David's steady gaze. She was observant, introspective, a girl who listened more than she spoke. Books had always been easier than people. She held her backpack close to her chest as if it were armor. The truck engine cut off. Silence. Then the curtains began to move. Across the street, a pale hand gently pulled fabric aside. On the left, a front door cracked open. On the right, someone stepped onto their porch under the pretense of watering plants that did not need watering. "New family?" someone murmured. "Did you know about this?" another voice whispered. "More trouble, if you ask me." The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. Angela heard them anyway. David pretended not to. Maya felt them like static against her skin. No one walked over. No one offered a handshake. No one said welcome. Instead, eyes measured. Maplewood had been home to middle-class white families for decades. Teachers, accountants, small business owners. Children rode bikes in organized loops. Holiday decorations were coordinated. Change was not common here, and difference was not invisible. Angela took a slow breath and forced a smile toward a woman watching from a porch 2 houses down. That woman was Mrs. Carolyn Reed. Carolyn Reed was 52 years old, medium height, with carefully styled blonde hair that barely moved in the breeze. Her posture was precise, her clothes pressed and pastel-toned. She had lived in Maplewood for 25 years and wore that fact like a badge. Her pale blue eyes were sharp and appraising, She was known for organizing neighborhood gatherings, charity drives, and informal safety committees. After a burglary years ago, a crime that was never solved, Caroline had grown increasingly protective of the street. Some said it made her vigilant. Others said it made her suspicious of anyone unfamiliar. She lowered her watering can slowly. "I'll keep an eye on things," she muttered to a woman beside her. That woman nodded. At the far end of Maplewood Drive stood a house slightly more shadowed than the rest. The blinds were always drawn halfway. The lawn was neat but untouched by decoration. That was where Mr. Harold Whitman lived. Harold Whitman was 67, thin but not fragile. His back remained straight despite age. His silver hair was cropped short. He had a narrow face, pale skin lined with years, and gray eyes that seemed to study more than they reacted. He rarely spoke more than necessary. Neighbors described him as strange, though no one could quite explain why. He lived alone. He returned home at irregular hours. Sometimes his porch light clicked on past midnight. He stood behind his window now, watching the moving truck through a narrow slit in the blinds. His expression did not change. Inside the Brooks' new house, the air smelled faintly of dust and unopened rooms. Angela stepped across the threshold first. "It's ours," she said softly. David set the box down in the living room. "We'll make it home." Maya wandered to the front window and looked back out. Mrs. Reed was still standing there. The first evening passed in quiet unpacking, but the next morning brought school. Maplewood High was a red brick building with banners celebrating decades of academic achievement. The hallways were bright, lined with trophy cases. Maya adjusted the strap of her backpack as she stepped inside. Conversations paused for half a second too long. A group of girls by the lockers leaned closer together. One boy muttered something under his breath that sounded like "new girl," but carried a tone heavier than curiosity. Maya walked to the front office. "Name?" the receptionist asked without looking up. "Maya Brooks?" The woman's eyes lifted briefly, then dropped again. "Welcome." The word felt procedural. By lunch, whispers had already circled. "She's from Chicago." "I heard they just moved in on Maplewood." "Didn't know that house was for sale." Two boys at a nearby table snickered. One said, just loud enough, "Hope she's not trouble." Maya kept her gaze steady on her tray. Across the cafeteria, a girl with shoulder-length light brown hair and freckles hesitated before sitting down beside her. "I'm Lily," she said quietly. Lily Thompson was 14 as well. Average height, soft features, green eyes that held uncertainty but also kindness. She had grown up on Maplewood Drive her entire life. Unlike many of her classmates, Lily was not quick to adopt opinions handed down from parents. She was thoughtful, observant, and often conflicted when confronted with injustice she did not yet know how to challenge. "Hi," Maya replied. It was a small moment, but it mattered. Back on Maplewood Drive, Caroline Reed gathered two neighbors in her kitchen. "I'm not saying anything," she began, which meant she was, "but we have to think about safety." Her friend nodded. "The street's been peaceful for years." Caroline folded her hands tightly. "Exactly." That night, Angela stood at the kitchen sink, staring out into the darkening street. "Did you feel it?" she asked quietly. David didn't look up from assembling a bookshelf. "Feel what?" "The way they looked at us." David paused, then resumed tightening a screw. "It's the first day." Angela wanted to believe him. Outside, a porch light flicked on at the far end of the street. Mr. Whitman's house. He stepped out briefly, scanning the road before retreating back inside. Maya watched from her bedroom window. Something about him felt different from the others. Not warmer, just less reactive. As night settled over Maplewood, the street returned to its rehearsed quiet. But behind closed doors, conversations continued. about safety, about change, about who belonged. And in the Brooks' new house, 3 people lay awake a little longer than usual, not because of boxes left unpacked, but because silence can sometimes be louder than words. The second week in Maplewood did not arrive with open hostility. It arrived with something quieter. Repetition. The same glances. The same pauses in conversation when Angela walked past. The same subtle recalibration of space whenever David stepped onto the sidewalk. Whispers, once faint, began to take shape. They drifted across trimmed lawns and through half-open windows. You know how kids from the city can be. I'm just saying we should keep an eye out. Black kids are usually trouble. Their parents don't teach them properly. No one said it loudly. No one said it directly to Angela. But the tone traveled, and tone is often more honest than words. Angela refused to shrink. Each morning she walked to the mailbox with her shoulders square and her chin slightly lifted. She wore simple blouses and fitted slacks, professional yet understated. When she smiled, it was deliberate, warm but measured. She had spent years in corporate environments where being composed was a form of armor. In college, she had once been followed around a department store by security while shopping for a graduation dress. That day had taught her that dignity must sometimes be maintained alone. So now, when Mrs. Caroline Reed passed by with her golden retriever, Angela nodded politely. The golden retriever was named Baxter, a 6-year-old, broad-shouldered dog with honey-colored fur and patient brown eyes. Baxter had the relaxed gait of an animal that had never known instability. He tugged gently on the leash toward Angela once, tail wagging, but Caroline tightened her grip slightly, not harshly, just enough to redirect him. Caroline offered a tight smile in return. "Settling in?" she asked. "Slowly," Angela replied. "Maplewood values peace. We all look out for one another." The sentence lingered longer than necessary. Caroline's home became the unofficial center of neighborhood conversation. Her kitchen, bright with white cabinets and framed family photos, hosted a small gathering of women one Thursday evening. Among them was Patricia Miller, a tall, narrow-faced woman in her late 40s who worked part-time as a substitute teacher. Patricia's cautious temperament had sharpened after her son was caught shoplifting years earlier. Since then, she believed discipline must be visible and preventative. Another was Donna Hayes, a retired nurse with soft features but firm opinions. Donna prided herself on practicality. "It's not about race," she insisted that night, though race was the unspoken anchor of the conversation. "It's about safety." Caroline folded her hands on the granite countertop. "We don't know them. That's all I'm saying. It's responsible to stay aware." They nodded. Awareness felt harmless when phrased that way. Across the street, David bent over their small front yard with a push mower. He moved with controlled strength, each pass neat and straight. Sweat darkened the back of his gray t-shirt. He had always believed that action spoke louder than suspicion. Growing up in Detroit, he had watched his father repair engines long after customers had left, simply to prove that work ethic could not be questioned. David inherited that belief, so he cut the grass evenly. He repaired the loose hinge on the fence. He waved to passing joggers. One of those joggers was Mark Ellis, a 30-year-old accountant who lived 3 houses down. Mark was tall and lean, with sandy hair and a habit of avoiding prolonged eye contact. He slowed briefly as he passed David. "Looks good," he said, gesturing to the lawn. "Appreciate it," David replied. Mark nodded once and continued running. From his porch, he later told his wife, "He seems fine." But even that mild endorsement carried a qualifier. Maya felt the whispers differently. At school, they grew legs. She walked into English class one morning to find a folded note on her desk. It wasn't threatening. Just 3 words written in looping ink. "Don't start drama." She unfolded it slowly, her expression unreadable. Across the room, 2 girls watched her reaction, One of them was Hannah Porter, captain of the junior varsity cheer squad, petite with perfectly straight blonde hair and a smile that rarely reached her eyes. Hannah thrived on social hierarchy. Her confidence depended on clearly defined circles. She leaned back in her chair, pretending indifference. Lily Thompson noticed. Lily had been quiet since sitting beside Maya on the first day. She wasn't bold by nature, but she disliked unfairness in a way that unsettled her. Her parents, both public school teachers, had raised her to question assumptions. She leaned toward Maya. "Ignore them," she whispered. Maya nodded, though ignoring something does not erase it. After school, Lily invited Maya to walk home together. The late afternoon sun softened the sharpness of the brick houses. Lily's backpack hung loosely off one shoulder. "They're not all like that," she said carefully. "I know," Maya replied. She did know, but knowing did not eliminate the tension in her chest. They stopped at the corner where Maplewood Drive began. Lily hesitated before speaking again. "My mom says change makes people nervous." Maya offered a faint smile. "We're not that scary." Lily almost laughed. That night, as darkness settled, another pattern emerged. At precisely 11:47 p.m., a pair of headlights slid slowly down Maplewood Drive. The car turned into the driveway at the far end. Mr. Harold Whitman's house. The engine cut. A moment later, his porch light flicked on. He stepped out, carrying what looked like a slim leather briefcase. Even in the dim light, his posture remained straight, his movements efficient. He paused briefly, scanning the street with quiet attention before entering his home. From her bedroom window, Maya noticed the consistency. "He's always late," she murmured. Angela stepped beside her. "Some people keep different hours." "What does he do?" Angela shook her head gently. "Everyone has a story." The Whitman house light remained on past midnight. No music, no television glow, just steady illumination. Meanwhile, inside Caroline Reed's home, the meeting concluded with quiet determination. "We'll organize a neighborhood safety watch," Caroline announced. "Just routine, nothing dramatic." The women agreed. A sign-up sheet circulated. The language remained careful. Community, protection, vigilance. The following Saturday, David decided to introduce himself properly. He walked door to door along the immediate stretch of Maplewood Drive, offering a firm handshake and a brief smile. Some doors opened halfway, some barely at all. Patricia Miller accepted his greeting stiffly. Donna Hayes nodded but did not invite conversation. Mark Ellis seemed almost apologetic in his politeness. At Caroline Reed's house, David extended his hand. "Just wanted to say hello. We're glad to be here." Caroline's smile remained composed. "Maplewood has certain standards. I'm sure you understand." David held her gaze. "We value the same things." Her expression flickered, uncertainty perhaps, before returning to neutrality. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned amber, David stood back from the fence he had repaired. It was sturdy now, balanced. He felt the weight of being observed, but refused to look around for proof. Inside, Angela placed framed photos on the living room shelf. Wedding pictures, Maya at age 5 missing her front teeth, a family trip to Lake Michigan. Evidence of continuity, of normalcy, of belonging. But outside, on Maplewood Drive, the whispers had matured into something more structured. Parents called children indoors earlier than usual. Curtains closed a little faster. Conversations lowered in volume as the Brooks family stepped outside. And still, no direct accusation. No overt hostility, just accumulation. Near midnight, Maya heard the faint rumble of Whitman's car again. She rose from bed quietly and peeked through her blinds. The porch light at the end of the street glowed once more. Whitman exited the vehicle. Expression unreadable, briefcase in hand. For a split second his eyes lifted, not toward her window but scanning, measuring, assessing. The street held its breath. Then the door shut behind him. Silence returned. But silence, Maya realized, was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of waiting. The night it happened began like any other, but the air felt heavier than usual, thick with the quiet weight that sometimes settles over suburban streets after a long day of unspoken tension. Maplewood Drive lay still under a pale wash of moonlight. The lawns were silvered. The mailboxes cast thin shadows across the sidewalk. Crickets hummed in steady rhythm, and somewhere in the distance a train horn echoed faintly, then dissolved into silence. Inside the Brooks house, the lights were dim. Angela had gone to bed early, exhaustion pressing against her temples after another day of polite restraint. She lay on her side of the bed, eyes open in the dark, listening to the small sounds of a new home. Wood settling, pipes shifting, the unfamiliar creak of a staircase. David was not there. He had left that afternoon for a brief overnight work trip to Springfield, a last-minute call from a client requiring his presence. His suitcase had been small, packed efficiently. He had kissed Angela on the forehead before leaving and reminded Maya to lock the back door. Just one night, he had said. His absence felt larger than 24 hours. Maya could not sleep. She sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, her math textbook open but unread. The digital clock beside her bed read 11:36 p.m. The house felt too quiet without her father's steady footsteps or the soft murmur of his late-night phone calls. Restless, she stood and drifted toward her window. Across the street stood the home of Mrs. Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor Hayes was 72 years old, a widow for nearly a decade. She was small in stature, barely 5 feet tall, with fine white hair cut in a neat bob that framed her soft, lined face. Her pale blue eyes carried both gentleness and fatigue. She had lived in Maplewood longer than most residents and had once hosted holiday dinners that filled her dining room with laughter. After her husband's passing, she had grown quieter, retreating into routines: morning tea on the porch, afternoon crossword puzzles, evening television until 10 sharp. She was known for her meticulous rose bushes and for feeding a gray stray cat that occasionally wandered through the neighborhood. The cat, thin and cautious, answered to no name but responded to her voice. Tonight, her living room lights were still on. That alone was unusual. Maya leaned closer to the glass. The yellow glow from Mrs. Hayes' windows spilled onto the lawn in uneven shapes. Shadows moved inside, too fast to belong to someone moving slowly. A figure crossed the room. Not small, not fragile, tall, broad-shouldered, unfamiliar. Maya's breath tightened. The front door of Mrs. Hayes' house opened abruptly. A man stepped out, his face partially obscured by shadow. He wore a dark jacket and jeans. His movements were controlled, unhurried, as if he had done this before. Under the streetlight, his profile became briefly visible. A strong jaw, short-cropped hair, expression unreadable. He closed the door behind him. Maya's eyes darted back inside the illuminated living room. Through the gap in the curtains, she saw Mrs. Hayes lying on the floor beside the coffee table. Her small frame was still, one arm angled awkwardly beneath her. The gray, stray cat stood a few feet away, frozen, its eyes reflecting the lamplight. Maya gasped softly and stumbled backward from the window, her legs giving way as she dropped to the floor. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She told herself she must be mistaken, that Mrs. Hayes had fainted, that the man was helping. But instinct said otherwise. Slowly, trembling, she raised herself just enough to peer through the lower corner of the window. The man had not left. He stood in the street now, head tilted slightly upward, toward her house, toward her window. For a split second, Maya felt certain their eyes met. Her body reacted before her mind could process it. She slid down the wall, pressing herself flat against the floor, breath shallow, palms cold against the hardwood. Outside, footsteps moved across asphalt. not running, walking. The sound shifted direction, around the side of the Brooks house. Maya's pulse spiked. She crawled toward her bedroom door and opened it silently. The hallway stretched long and dim. Angela's bedroom door was closed at the far end. Another sound, gravel crunching softly near the side yard. The man was circling the house, testing, listening. Maya pressed her back against the wall beside her door. The minutes felt endless. She imagined the door handle turning, imagined footsteps on the stairs. Instead, after what felt like an eternity, the crunch of gravel faded. A car engine started somewhere beyond the hedges. Then silence. Maya waited several seconds more before rising cautiously to the window again. The street was empty. Mrs. Hayes's front door remained closed. The lights inside still burned. At the far end of Maplewood Drive, another porch light flicked on. Mr. Harold Whitman's house. Whitman stood in his doorway, his thin frame outlined by the light behind him. Even from a distance, his posture was alert, his head angled slightly as though listening for something beyond ordinary hearing. He stepped onto his porch and scanned the street slowly from left to right. Did he see the man? Did he hear the engine? His expression remained unreadable. After a long moment, he retreated back inside, the porch light clicking off again. Maya remained frozen by the window. Her mind raced through possibilities. Call the police, wake her mother, stay quiet. She hesitated, fear tangling with uncertainty. What if she was wrong? What if Mrs. Hayes was simply ill and a family member had come to help? But Mrs. Hayes had no close family nearby. Angela had mentioned that in passing after checking the mailbox earlier that week. Maya's gaze returned to the Hayes house. The gray cat slipped through the slightly ajar front door and disappeared into the yard. The lights inside remained on. Maya moved down the hallway and knocked softly on her mother's bedroom door. "Mom?" she whispered. Angela stirred and opened the door, her curls slightly undone, eyes heavy but alert. "Maya? What's wrong?" "I think something happened across the street." Angela stepped past her daughter and looked through the living room window. The glow from Mrs. Hayes' home was visible even from there. "That's strange," Angela murmured. "She's usually asleep by now." Maya's voice trembled. "There was a man." Angela turned sharply. "What kind of man?" "I don't know, tall, dark jacket. He came out of her house. She was on the floor." Angela's breath caught. "Are you sure?" Maya nodded, though doubt flickered behind her eyes. Angela reached for her phone with steady hands that did not reflect the sudden rush of fear in her chest. She hesitated only a second before dialing emergency services. As the call connected, Maya glanced once more out the window. The street looked exactly as it had earlier. Calm, ordered, unchanged. But something irreversible had shifted beneath that surface. And at the far end of Maplewood Drive, behind closed blinds, Harold Whitman stood in the dark of his living room, watching. Morning arrived too quickly. Maplewood Drive, usually stirred awake by sprinklers and the low hum of commuting engines, was instead pierced by flashing red and blue lights. 2 patrol cars blocked the entrance to the street. Yellow tape stretched across Mrs. Eleanor Hayes's front yard, fluttering gently in the mild breeze as if trying to appear harmless. It failed. Angela stood on her porch with Maya beside her. Neither had slept after making the emergency call. Maya's eyes were rimmed red, not from tears but from the strain of replaying the image over and over again. The tall figure, the still body, the sense of being seen. The first officer to approach them was Sergeant Thomas Keller, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with cropped brown hair graying at the temples. His face was square and weathered, the kind shaped by years of reading people quickly. He carried himself with controlled authority. Keller had grown up in a neighboring town and believed strongly in order and routine. When those routines were disrupted, he grew more rigid, not less. "Mrs. Brooks?" he asked, glancing briefly at his notepad. Angela nodded. You're the one who called it in. Yes, my daughter saw something. Keller's eyes shifted to Maya. Not unkind. Not warm, either. Evaluating. What did you see? He asked. Maya described the man carefully, the height, the jacket, the way he walked. She mentioned the glance toward her window. Keller listened without interruption, his pen moving steadily. Did you recognize him? He asked. No. Any distinctive features? She shook her head. It was dark. Keller nodded once. We'll check surrounding cameras. Behind him, Detective Laura Ramirez stepped out of an unmarked sedan. Ramirez was in her early 30s, tall and lean, with dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail and sharp brown eyes that missed little. Unlike Keller, her expression carried curiosity rather than assumption. She had built a reputation for patience. Years earlier, a case she'd worked had collapsed due to premature conclusions by another detective. Since then, she trusted details more than instinct. She approached quietly. We'll need statements from everyone on the street, she said, her voice steady. Routine procedure. By mid-morning, Maplewood Drive resembled a stage set. Neighbors stood in clusters behind invisible boundaries, whispering into cupped hands. Curtains that had once merely shifted now remained fully drawn back. Mrs. Caroline Reed stood near her mailbox, arms folded tightly across her pastel cardigan. Baxter, her golden retriever, lay obediently at her feet, unusually still, as if sensing tension in the air. I'm not surprised, Patricia Miller murmured beside her. Caroline's jaw tightened. It's just... everything was fine before. The implication hung unspoken, but heavy. Across the street, officers moved in and out of Mrs. Hayes's home. Paramedics had already confirmed what Angela and Maya feared. Eleanor Hayes was gone. The gray, stray cat sat beneath a hedge, watching silently, tail wrapped around its thin body. When Keller reached Caroline, her posture shifted slightly, deference mixed with certainty. Sergeant, she began, lowering her voice just enough to suggest discretion. You should know that the new family across the street, they just moved in. Keller's pen paused. And? Caroline hesitated, aware that outright accusation might sound improper. Well, things have felt unsettled. Unsettled how? She gestured vaguely. Just different. Keller nodded slowly and made a note. By noon, officers had knocked on every door. Statements were taken, time frames established, movements accounted for. When Keller returned to Angela's porch, his tone had shifted subtly. Your husband wasn't home last night? Angela kept her voice even. He was on a work trip. Springfield. Anyone confirm that? He can. His company can. Keller's eyes flicked toward Maya again. We'll need his exact timeline. Angela felt the shift fully now. Not accusation, not yet, but attention. Inside their house, Detective Ramirez requested access to the Brooks exterior security camera. David had installed it years ago after a minor break-in at their old home. Angela retrieved the login credentials with steady hands. The footage played on Ramirez's tablet. The grainy black and white video showed the front lawn, the sidewalk, the edge of the street. At 11:42 p.m., a figure appeared briefly at the far corner of the frame. The image was blurred, indistinct. The man moved quickly, his face turned away from the camera. Within seconds, he was gone. Can you enhance that? Angela asked quietly. Ramirez shook her head. We'll try at the lab, but it's not promising. Maya leaned forward, studying the screen. It wasn't clear enough to confirm what she had seen. Doubt crept into her thoughts, unwelcome and persistent. By late afternoon, the whispers had hardened into narratives. She saw something, but the camera didn't. Her husband wasn't even home. That's convenient. At Maplewood High, the news traveled faster than official statements. By the time Maya arrived the next morning, Conversations halted mid-sentence as she passed. Hannah Porter watched her with open curiosity now, no longer hiding her scrutiny. During lunch, Lily approached Maya's table but hesitated. Her face looked troubled. "My mom says we shouldn't hang out for a while," Lily admitted quietly. Maya swallowed. "Because of what happened?" Lily nodded. "She thinks it's complicated." Lily's mother, Susan Thompson, was a thin, anxious woman in her early 40s who carried tension in the lines of her forehead. Years earlier, a burglary in a neighboring town had shaken her deeply. Since then, safety equaled distance. She did not see herself as prejudiced, only cautious. But caution, unchecked, often resembled exclusion. "I'm sorry," Lily whispered. Maya managed a small nod. "It's okay." It wasn't. That evening, at Caroline Reed's kitchen table, a petition began circulating. The language was carefully crafted. Request for thorough investigation into recent suspicious circumstances. No names mentioned, no direct accusations. But the implication was unmistakable. Donna Hayes signed first. Patricia Miller followed. Even Mark Ellis hesitated only briefly before adding his name. "It's just precaution," he told himself. Angela watched from her living room as neighbors walked past more slowly than usual, glancing at her house with new intensity. The sense of being measured had evolved into something sharper: assessment. David called that night from his hotel room. His voice crackled slightly through the speaker. "I heard," he said softly after Angela explained the morning's events. "They're asking about you," she replied. "Of course they are." He didn't sound surprised. He sounded tired. "I'll be home first thing," he said. "We'll handle it." After the call ended, Angela stood by the window. Across the street, Mrs. Hayes' house remained dark now, sealed and silent. A life reduced to investigation tape and rumor. At the far end of Maplewood Drive, Harold Whitman's porch light flicked on again. He stepped outside, hands in his coat pockets despite the mild weather. His gaze traveled the length of the street, lingering briefly on the Brooks house before shifting away. No one could tell what he was thinking. But he was watching. And so was everyone else. The tension that had settled over Maplewood Drive did not fade with time. It thickened. By the third day after Mrs. Eleanor Hayes's death, patrol cars were no longer constant fixtures on the street, but their absence did not restore normalcy. Curtains remained open longer than usual, as if neighbors feared missing the next development. Conversations lowered when Angela stepped outside, then resumed with renewed urgency once she returned indoors. David arrived home just after sunrise, his overnight bag slung over one shoulder, exhaustion visible in the tightness of his jaw. He had shaved during the drive back, as though physical order might help restore something intangible. Angela met him at the door. They embraced without words, the weight of scrutiny pressing against them both. By mid-morning, Detective Laura Ramirez returned with Sergeant Keller. Their expressions were measured, professional, but not neutral. "We reviewed additional footage," Ramirez began, holding a tablet in one hand. "From your exterior camera." Angela felt her stomach tighten. "You already looked at it." "We enhanced it." Inside the living room, the four of them stood before the screen. The black and white footage now appeared sharper, though still grainy. At 11:39 p.m., 3 minutes before the shadowed figure crossed the edge of the frame, a man approached the Brooks' front porch. He paused directly before their door. His face remained partially obscured, but his posture was clear. He stood there for nearly 20 seconds. Then he turned and walked away. Maya leaned closer. "That's him," she whispered. The footage did not show him entering the house. It did not show him knocking. But his presence lingered like accusation. "He was at your door," Keller said evenly. "We were asleep," Angela replied. "Except Maya." "Did he try the handle?" "No." Ramirez zoomed in on the timestamp. He stood there long enough to consider something. David's expression hardened slightly. "So what does that mean?" "It means," Keller answered, "that whoever did this was comfortable approaching your house." The statement hovered between implication and fact. 2 days later, the second development arrived. A forensic technician named Raymond Chu, thin, precise, with wire-rimmed glasses and a methodical way of speaking, knocked on the Brooks' door alongside Ramirez. Chu was in his early 40s, known within the department for his accuracy and lack of speculation. He carried a sealed evidence bag. "We recovered a cigarette butt from Mrs. Hayes's front yard," Ramirez said. David frowned. "I don't smoke." "Not regularly," Ramirez replied carefully. "But have you ever?" David hesitated. "Years ago. Occasionally at social events." Raymond Chu opened the folder in his hand. "The DNA from the filter matches your profile." The room seemed to shrink. Angela's hand instinctively found the edge of the kitchen counter to steady herself. "That's impossible. I introduced myself to her last week," David said slowly. "I stopped by. We talked for a few minutes. I might have had a cigarette with me." "Why?" Keller asked. David exhaled sharply. "Because I was nervous. Because the whole street was watching." Ramirez's gaze remained steady. "You didn't mention that in your initial statement." "You didn't ask." The distinction felt thin. Outside, word spread quickly. Patricia Miller was the first to repeat it aloud. "They found his DNA." Her voice trembled, not with certainty but with confirmation of suspicion. Caroline Reed listened with tightened lips. "I knew something wasn't right." By evening, Maplewood Drive no longer whispered. It murmured openly. A white police sedan rolled slowly to a stop in front of the Brooks house just after dusk. Neighbors gathered discreetly behind curtains, pretending to adjust blinds. Inside, Angela stood frozen as Keller stepped forward. "David Brooks," he said formally, "you are under arrest for suspicion in connection with the death of Eleanor Hayes." Maya's breath caught audibly. "What?" David did not resist. He turned toward Angela, eyes steady. "It's going to be okay," he said quietly. Handcuffs clicked into place. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Angela stepped forward instinctively, but Ramirez placed a gentle hand on her arm. "We'll sort this out." "Sort this out?" Angela repeated, disbelief fracturing her voice. Outside, Baxter barked once, sharp and uncertain, before Caroline hushed him. The police car door shut. As the vehicle pulled away, the Brooks' front yard felt exposed under the porch light. Inside, Angela sank into a chair at the kitchen table, hands trembling for the first time since moving to Maplewood. She had held composure through whispers, through petitions, through polite suspicion. But this was different. This was public. Maya stood motionless near the window. "I should have done something," she whispered. Angela looked up sharply. "You did what you could." "I saw him. I just froze." Angela rose and crossed the room, pulling her daughter into an embrace. "You're 14, she said softly. "You survived." But guilt is not logical. It embeds itself in the smallest pauses. Later that night, Maya's phone buzzed softly. It was Lily. "I'm so sorry. This doesn't feel right." Maya stared at the screen for several seconds before replying. "They think it's him." A pause. "I don't." The message was brief, but it cut through isolation. Across town, in a modest newsroom cluttered with half-empty coffee cups and aging bulletin boards, a local journalist named Daniel Harper scanned police reports on his computer screen. Harper was 36, tall and slightly unkempt, with dark curls he rarely bothered to tame. He had once worked for a larger Chicago paper before downsizing forced him back to smaller assignments. Since then, he had grown wary of easy narratives. He believed that stories often unfolded in layers, and he distrusted conclusions reached too quickly. The Hayes case caught his attention immediately. New family moves in. Elderly resident murdered. Husband's DNA found at scene. He leaned back in his chair. "It's too clean," he muttered. Harper printed the preliminary report and circled the timeline with a pen. The proximity between suspicion and arrest struck him as swift. He made a note to attend the next press briefing. Back on Maplewood Drive, Harold Whitman stood at his living room window, hands clasped loosely behind his back. His gray eyes followed the departing police car until it turned the corner and vanished. His expression revealed nothing. Not surprise, not approval, simply observation. He stepped away from the window and turned off the light. Inside the Brooks house, silence pressed heavily against the walls. Angela sat upright long after midnight, replaying every conversation of the past week. Every glance, every subtle shift in tone. She thought of the cigarette, of David's attempt to seem friendly. Outside, the street looked unchanged. Trim lawns, still mailboxes, calm facades. But perception had shifted irreversibly, and as Maplewood settled into uneasy sleep, 3 truths lingered in the dark. A stranger had stood at the Brooks door. A cigarette linked David to the scene, and suspicion had finally found its target. The courthouse in downtown Maplewood was older than most of the homes on Maplewood Drive. Built of pale limestone, its columns rose with solemn dignity, as if justice itself required architecture to appear unshakable. On the morning of David Brooks' preliminary hearing, the sky was overcast, low gray clouds pressing down on the square like an unspoken verdict. The air carried a faint chill despite the lingering warmth of early fall. Angela stood at the base of the courthouse steps, her coat wrapped tightly around her slender frame. She had chosen navy blue, professional, composed, deliberate. Her curls were pulled back again, not loosely this time, but firmly, as if structure could compensate for uncertainty. Maya stood beside her, taller than she had seemed weeks ago, her braids neatly tied, her expression guarded beyond her years. They moved together through the courthouse doors under the weight of watching eyes. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt less like inquiry and more like confirmation. The wooden benches were filled not only with reporters and officers, but with several familiar faces from Maplewood Drive. Caroline Reed sat in the second row, posture upright, hands folded primly in her lap. Patricia Miller and Donna Hayes flanked her. Even Mark Ellis had come, though he avoided meeting Angela's gaze. At the prosecution table stood Assistant District Attorney Gregory Shaw. Shaw was in his early 40s, tall and narrow-faced, with slicked-back dark hair and a voice trained for controlled projection. He had built his reputation on efficiency and decisive arguments. To him, cases were narratives to be structured convincingly. He believed strongly in pattern recognition. When pieces aligned neatly, he rarely questioned the alignment. His suit was impeccably tailored, his movements crisp. At the defense table sat Linda Carver, David's court-appointed attorney. Carver was 58, with streaks of silver through her dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes behind rectangular glasses. She was not flamboyant in speech, but deliberate. Years ago, she had defended a man falsely accused due to circumstantial evidence, only to see the jury convict. The case had haunted her ever since, sharpening her resolve against assumptions dressed as proof. David entered the courtroom in a plain suit borrowed from his father-in-law, wrists free but posture rigid. He looked directly at Angela and Maya before sitting beside Carver. His face showed restraint more than fear. When proceedings began, Shaw's voice carried confidently. "Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed the court, "this case concerns a quiet neighborhood disrupted by violence, a neighborhood that had known stability until recently." His pause was slight, calculated, until change arrived. Angela felt the words settle heavily. Shaw continued, outlining the timeline. The cigarette butt bearing David's DNA, the security footage showing a man at the Brooks porch, the fact that David had not been home at the time of the crime. An absence that conveniently creates uncertainty, Shaw remarked. Linda Carver rose slowly. My client introduced himself to Mrs. Hayes days before her death. The cigarette is not evidence of murder. It is evidence of nervous hospitality. Her voice was calm but firm. There is no footage placing him inside that home. No eyewitness identification, no weapon, no motive. Shaw turned slightly. Motive can stem from many factors, Miss Carver. Sometimes resentment. Sometimes perceived exclusion. The implication lingered in the room. It was subtle but unmistakable, the suggestion of difference as disruption. David was called briefly to clarify his movements. I stopped by Mrs. Hayes' house last week, he said steadily. I wanted to introduce myself. I had a cigarette in my pocket. I may have left it in her yard, that's all. And the night of her death? Shaw asked. I was in Springfield for work. Without immediate verification. My employer can confirm. Shaw nodded, as if acknowledging, but not conceding. Outside the courthouse, a small cluster of local media gathered. Daniel Harper stood among them, notepad in hand. He listened carefully as Shaw summarized the prosecution's stance to reporters, emphasizing the coincidences. Harper's brow furrowed. The narrative felt polished too early. Inside Maplewood High, the ripple effect spread. Maya walked down the hallway under heavier stares than before. Whispers were no longer coded, they were direct. That's her dad. Guess the rumors were right. At her locker, Lily approached hesitantly. Her freckles stood out against pale skin flushed from anxiety. I remember something, Lily said quietly. Maya looked up. The night before everything happened. I was walking Baxter for Mrs. Reed. I saw a dark SUV parked near Mrs. Hayes's house. I didn't recognize it. Maya's heart quickened. Did you tell anyone? Lily shook her head. I didn't think it mattered. Do you remember the license plate? No, just that it had tinted windows. It was a small detail, but small details sometimes refuse to stay small. That afternoon, Lily tried mentioning it to her mother, Susan Thompson. Susan's shoulders tightened instantly. Lily, this is exactly why we're staying out of it, she said, voice low and urgent. The police know what they're doing. But what if... No. The word ended the conversation. Meanwhile, at a quiet cafe 2 blocks from the courthouse, Harold Whitman sat across from Linda Carver. He wore a simple gray coat and spoke in measured tones. Up close, his face revealed fine lines etched deeply around his eyes, lines carved not only by age, but by experience. There was an intensity in his gaze that contradicted his otherwise unassuming presence. I may have information relevant to your client's timeline, Whitman said calmly. Carver regarded him carefully. And why come forward now? I prefer facts over assumptions. What kind of information? Whitman paused briefly. The kind that deserves proper handling. He did not elaborate further, but his certainty carried weight. Back in the courtroom, the hearing concluded without resolution. Bail was denied pending further investigation. The courtroom emptied in hushed conversation. As Angela and Maya stepped outside, cameras flashed briefly. A reporter asked, Mrs. Brooks, do you believe your husband is being treated fairly? Angela stopped. For a moment, fatigue threatened to fracture her composure. Then she answered evenly, We believe in the truth. Caroline Reed watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. Patricia Miller whispered something beside her. Heads nodded. On Maplewood Drive that evening, the isolation felt tangible. No one pretended neutrality anymore. Mail was collected quickly. Doors closed promptly. The petition Caroline had circulated gained more signatures. Angela sat alone at the kitchen table after Maya went upstairs. The house felt larger without David's presence. Every creak carried accusation. She replayed Shaw's phrasing, until change arrived. Change. As if they were not people, but disruption, embodied. Across the street, Mrs. Hayes's house remained dark, windows reflecting only the faint glow of streetlights. The gray, stray cat sat once more beneath the hedge, unmoving, as if waiting for a voice that would never call again. At the far end of Maplewood Drive, Harold Whitman's porch light flicked on briefly, then off again. Inside the Brooks home, silence thickened. The trial had not delivered answers. It had delivered distance, and in that widening space, the Brooks family felt more alone than ever before. The second court session drew a larger crowd than the first. Word had spread beyond Maplewood Drive, beyond even the small circle of local media. The sky that morning was clear, almost deceptively bright, as if the town had decided to stage a contradiction to the heaviness that had lingered for weeks. Angela stood once more at the courthouse steps, but this time her posture carried less fragility and more resolve. Fatigue had sharpened into focus. Maya stood beside her, eyes steady, hands no longer trembling. Inside the courtroom, Assistant District Attorney Gregory Shaw appeared confident, his files neatly arranged, his tone prepared for reinforcement. Linda Carver sat composed at the defense table, reviewing notes with quiet concentration. David entered under escort again, though without handcuffs this time, his movements controlled but less rigid than before. He looked toward Angela and Maya briefly, then forward. The murmurs in the room softened when a new figure stepped through the back doors. Harold Whitman. He wore a dark suit, impeccably fitted, the simplicity of it drawing attention precisely because it contrasted so sharply with his usual understated presence on Maplewood Drive. His silver hair was combed back neatly. His posture, always upright, now carried unmistakable authority. The quiet neighbor who rarely exchanged more than a nod had transformed into someone unmistakably deliberate. Angela felt a flicker of surprise. Caroline Reed, seated in the second row again, stiffened visibly. Whitman walked forward with measured steps and took a seat behind the defense table. Linda Carver leaned toward him briefly. They exchanged only a few words. When proceedings began, Shaw resumed his structured narrative, reiterating the DNA evidence and the timeline. He spoke of proximity, of circumstantial convergence, of patterns. Then Linda Carver stood. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm but resonant, "the defense would like to call a new witness." The courtroom shifted subtly. "Mr. Harold Whitman." Whitman approached the stand without hesitation. Up close, the fine lines around his eyes suggested long observation rather than passivity. When he raised his right hand to swear the oath, his voice carried a steadiness that did not seek attention. It commanded it. "Mr. Whitman," Carver began, "where were you on the night of Mrs. Hayes's death?" "At the Lantern Bar on Franklin Avenue," Whitman replied evenly. The Lantern Bar was a modest establishment less than a mile from Maplewood Drive. Its neon sign flickered faintly in the evenings. The bar was owned by Anthony Russo, a thick-set man in his late 50s with thinning dark hair and a gravelly voice shaped by decades of late nights and cigarette smoke. Russo prided himself on remembering faces and times. Routine was his livelihood. "And who else was there?" Carver asked. Whitman's gaze shifted briefly toward David. "Mr. David Brooks." A ripple of sound moved through the courtroom. Assistant District Attorney Shaw rose immediately. "Objection." Carver continued calmly, "Mr. Whitman, how can you confirm that?" Whitman reached into his briefcase and withdrew a small flash drive. "The Lantern Bar maintains internal security footage. I obtained a copy." Shaw's expression tightened. The courtroom monitor flickered to life. The grainy footage displayed the interior of the Lantern Bar on the night in question. The timestamp read 11:31 p.m. David stood near the counter, speaking briefly with Anthony Russo, who nodded in the footage. At 11:44 p.m., within minutes of the estimated time of Mrs. Hayes's death, David remained visible in the frame. The image was clear enough. Sergeant Keller, seated near the aisle, leaned forward unconsciously. Shaw attempted to recover. "And how did you come into possession of this footage?" Whitman paused only a fraction of a second. "Because I requested it in the course of my investigation." "In what capacity?" Shaw pressed. Whitman's expression remained composed. "As a federal agent." The words landed heavily. A murmur surged through the courtroom. Judge Eleanor Matthews, a tall woman in her early 60s with a commanding presence and silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun, leaned forward. She had presided over cases for over 20 years and rarely displayed overt reaction. But even she allowed a slight pause. "Clarify," she said. Whitman continued, his tone unchanged. "For several months I have been operating in this district under the authority of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My presence on Maplewood Drive was part of an ongoing investigation into a suspect with a pattern of targeting elderly residents in suburban neighborhoods." Angela's breath caught. Shaw's posture shifted from certainty to recalculation. "Are you suggesting," Shaw said slowly, "that the accused is not connected?" "I am stating," Whitman replied evenly, "that Mr. Brooks was in my line of sight at the bar during the time frame in which Mrs. Hayes was killed." "And the suspect you were investigating?" Whitman's gaze moved briefly toward the gallery. "A local contractor, Michael Turner." The name hung in the air. Michael Turner was a familiar figure in Maplewood, 45 years old, broad-shouldered, with a sun-weathered face and permanent grease stains beneath his fingernails. Turner had repaired fences, replaced gutters, fixed leaking pipes across the neighborhood. He was known for his casual friendliness, for waving from his pickup truck, for offering discounted services to long-term residents. Few questioned his presence because it had always been there. But patterns had existed beneath familiarity. "He serviced Mrs. Hayes's property 3 weeks prior," Whitman continued. "He possessed knowledge of her schedule, and he drives a dark SUV." From the second row, Caroline Reed's composure faltered. Assistant District Attorney Shaw hesitated before asking, "Do you have direct evidence linking Mr. Turner?" Whitman's reply was precise. "He was apprehended early this morning after attempting to leave the state. Items recovered from his vehicle connect him to the scene." The courtroom erupted into layered whispers. Judge Matthews struck her gavel once. "Order!" Linda Carver spoke softly but clearly. "Your Honor, given the verified alibi and the new developments in custody, the defense moves for immediate dismissal." Shaw remained standing, but his earlier confidence had dissolved into reluctant acknowledgement. The prosecution withdraws its request for continued detention. Judge Matthews looked directly at David. "Mr. Brooks, you are released." The words were simple. The effect was seismic. Angela's shoulders sagged in visible relief. Maya exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for weeks. David closed his eyes briefly before standing. As proceedings concluded, Daniel Harper stood near the courthouse entrance, capturing reactions with quiet intensity. He had already begun drafting the opening line in his head, not about the crime itself, but about the cost of assumption. He watched as neighbors exited the building in subdued silence. Caroline Reed avoided eye contact entirely. Outside, Lily Thompson stood near the bottom of the courthouse steps, shifting nervously. She approached Maya as the family descended. "I told my mom about the SUV," Lily said quietly. She remembered seeing it too, she just didn't want to say anything. Maya nodded slowly. "It was always there," Lily added, "parked like it belonged." Across the street from the courthouse, Harold Whitman stepped aside, his expression returning to the quiet neutrality Maplewood had always known. He did not seek acknowledgement. He did not offer explanation beyond what was necessary. His work in Maplewood was finished, but its consequences were only beginning to settle. As the Brooks family walked toward their car together, The distance between accusation and truth felt both vast and fragile. Justice had spoken, and the quietest neighbor on the block had been listening all along. The morning after David Brooks was officially cleared, Maplewood Drive looked the same, but it did not feel the same. The lawns were still trimmed, the mailboxes still aligned in quiet order. The sun still rose over identical rooftops in pale gold light. Yet something invisible had shifted. The air carried not tension this time, but hesitation, the kind that follows realization. David stepped out onto the porch beside Angela, breathing in the cool air as though reclaiming space. He had slept for nearly 10 uninterrupted hours for the first time in weeks. The strain had not disappeared entirely from his face, but it had softened. Angela stood beside him, shoulders relaxed in a way they had not been since the night of flashing patrol lights. Maya lingered a step behind them, taller somehow, not physically, but in presence. Across the street, curtains moved again, but this time they did not snap shut. Caroline Reed emerged from her house slowly, Baxter at her side. The golden retriever's tail wagged gently, unaware of reputations or reversals. Caroline's posture was less rigid than usual. She paused halfway across the street, then continued walking until she stood at the edge of the Brooks lawn. Angela met her gaze calmly. "I misjudged," Caroline said quietly. The words were not dramatic. They were careful, measured. Caroline had built much of her adult life on certainty, on protecting a version of order she believed fragile. Years earlier, after a burglary that left her shaken in her own home, she had promised herself she would never overlook warning signs again. But somewhere along that vigilance, she had mistaken difference for danger. "I'm sorry," she added, voice low. Angela studied her for a long moment. There was no triumph in her expression, only exhaustion and dignity. "We're still your neighbors," Angela replied. Caroline nodded once, then turned back toward her house. It was not reconciliation, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. Not everyone stepped forward. Patricia Miller kept her distance, embarrassment making her avoid eye contact entirely. Mark Ellis offered a hesitant wave from his driveway, but did not cross the street. Change, as Lily had once said, made people nervous. At Maplewood High, the shift was more immediate. Rumors dissolved under facts. Hannah Porter's sharp glances softened into neutrality. Teachers who had watched Maya cautiously now greeted her by name. In the hallway, Lily approached without hesitation. "I'm glad," she said simply. "So am I," Maya replied. The ease between them was no longer fragile. It was chosen. Over the next weeks, they spent afternoons studying at the local library, a red brick building tucked between a bakery and a hardware store. They walked home together openly. Lily's mother, Susan Thompson, offered a quiet apology one evening when Maya stopped by to return a borrowed notebook. Susan's thin shoulders relaxed as she spoke. "I let fear guide me," she admitted. "That wasn't fair." Maya nodded, not holding on to resentment. She had learned quickly that understanding did not require forgetting, but it did require forward motion. Meanwhile, Daniel Harper's article ran on the front page of the Maplewood Gazette. The headline was restrained but direct. Assumptions and Accountability in Maplewood. Harper wrote not only about the wrongful suspicion placed on David Brooks, but about the ease with which narratives form when fear goes unchecked. He described the speed of judgment, the weight of public opinion, and the quiet power of evidence. The article circulated beyond Maplewood. It prompted uncomfortable conversations at dinner tables. It prompted reflection. Within a week, the informal safety committee Caroline had organized quietly dissolved. There was no official announcement, no final meeting. The petition clipboard disappeared from her kitchen counter. The women who had once gathered there began redirecting their energy toward ordinary concerns, school fundraisers, charity drives, community gardens. The tone shifted from vigilance to cooperation. At the far end of Maplewood Drive, Harold Whitman's house remained dim for several evenings in a row. His porch light did not flicker on at midnight. His blinds stayed closed. On the fourth morning, a black sedan with government plates idled briefly in his driveway. Angela noticed from her window. Later that afternoon, a small envelope appeared in her mailbox. It bore no return address. The handwriting was precise, deliberate. Inside was a single page. Mrs. Brooks, thank you for your composure when it mattered most. Integrity often reveals itself under pressure. Your family did not bend. H.W. Angela read the note twice before handing it to David. Maya leaned over his shoulder to read it as well. He never told us, Maya murmured. He didn't need to, David replied. That evening, they walked together down Maplewood Drive. As they passed Whitman's house, they noticed the curtains drawn fully back for the first time since moving in. The interior looked empty. The lawn remained trimmed, but the mailbox stood slightly ajar, as if left mid-transition. He was never just the quiet neighbor, Angela said softly. No, David agreed. In the weeks that followed, Maplewood did not transform overnight into a model of perfect unity. There were still moments of awkward silence, still conversations cut short, but the overt suspicion had dissolved. The Brooks family's presence no longer felt provisional. One Saturday afternoon, a local television crew arrived on Maplewood Drive. The reporter, Claire Donovan, was in her early 30s with auburn hair and an approachable warmth that balanced professionalism. She had covered community stories for years and believed in highlighting resilience rather than scandal. She stood on the sidewalk with a microphone in hand as a small camera crew adjusted equipment. Mrs. Brooks, Maya, she began gently, after everything that happened, what would you want people to understand? Angela glanced at her daughter. Maya stepped forward slightly. The wind lifted a few loose braids from her shoulders, but her voice remained steady. She did not speak about fear. She did not speak about anger. She did not recount the humiliation of being watched or the weight of suspicion. She simply said, living with kindness brings light into the darkest places. Claire Donovan lowered the microphone slightly, as though recognizing the completeness of the statement. Behind the camera, Lily stood quietly offering a small, proud smile. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting long shadows across Maplewood Drive, Angela stood in the front yard and looked around. Caroline waved from her porch, not stiffly this time, but genuinely. Mark Ellis crossed the street briefly to return a borrowed garden tool. Baxter bounded across the lawn toward Maya, tail wagging freely, no leash pulling him back. The street had not become flawless, but it had become aware. Inside their home, the Brooks family gathered in the living room. David rested one arm along the back of the couch. Angela leaned against him. Maya sat between them. Do you think it'll stay this way? Maya asked quietly. David considered the question. People don't change in a single moment, he said, but moments can start something. Angela nodded. Truth has a way of making space. Outside, Maplewood Drive settled into its familiar quiet once more, but this time, the silence did not feel like waiting. It felt like learning. And for the first time since the moving truck had arrived under watchful eyes, the Brooks family did not feel like visitors. They felt like neighbors. This story is not only about a family who was wrongly accused. It is about how quickly fear can turn into judgment, and how easily silence can allow injustice to grow. In everyday life, we may not stand in a courtroom, but we stand in smaller moments of decision every day. We decide whether to greet a new neighbor with kindness or suspicion. We decide whether to repeat a rumor or pause and seek the truth. We decide whether to judge someone by appearance or by character. Maplewood reminds us that prejudice rarely announces itself loudly. It often hides behind words like safety, caution, or tradition. Yet, when we allow assumptions to replace understanding, we risk harming innocent people. The Brooks family did not fight with anger. They endured with dignity. And in the end, truth did what fear could not. It brought light. In our daily lives, we must ask ourselves honest questions. Do we treat people differently because they look different from us? Do we assume before we listen? Do we stand up when someone is being judged unfairly? Justice is not only the work of courts and lawyers, it is the responsibility of neighbors, classmates, co-workers, and friends. The educational lesson here is simple but powerful. Teach your children empathy. Teach them that character is not defined by color, background, or accent. Teach them that courage sometimes looks like staying calm when the world doubts you. And most importantly, teach them that truth matters more than convenience. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Start a conversation in your home about fairness and respect. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. What would you have done if you lived on Maplewood Drive? Would you have spoken up sooner? Subscribe to this channel for more stories that challenge us to think, grow, and treat one another with dignity. Your support helps these messages reach more people. May God bless everyone reading this. May He guide us to act with wisdom, compassion, and courage in our everyday lives. If you believe that kindness can overcome prejudice and the truth will always rise, comment Amen below.